Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just waiting a few moments for everybody to come through into the webinar. You can just pop up your virtual hand if you can hear and see everybody. Thank you. And if you do want to ask a question, please pop it into the Q&A and we'll leave the chat section just for chat. Just a few more moments. Sorry. And for anyone new who just joined, if you have any questions, just pop them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and you can just chat amongst the attendees in the chat box. Okay, I think we can get started, Paula, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. So for those of you who haven't met me before, I'm Paula Spots, I'm A-Law's chair, and Tiffany is our legal support officer for those who haven't met her. And I'm not actually going to be chairing the event today. I'm going to be handing over to our Young Animal Lawyers Network committee. And I had the privilege then of introducing our hosts. And this is the launch event of the Young Animal Lawyers Network, which is a new part of A-Law for young law professionals from postgraduate up to 5 years PQE who are interested in supporting A-Law's work, learning about animal law, and possibly even forging a career in this area, but otherwise using their legal skills to help animals. So the group aims to bridge the gap between our student network and full membership, and the group hopes to support A-Law and foster a community of young animal lawyers. They will be no doubt providing other careers, events and guidance, opportunities for networking, for chatting and for sharing information about the latest good book. And there's been a couple of new ones recently, which I'm sure are going to pop up. And also undertaking research and helping with pro bono work and supporting animal charities using their legal skills under the mentorship of our members. So we're really excited at this new development in A-Law. So welcome Connie, Siobhan, Rachel, Abby and Alia. And I'm going to hand very swiftly over to Siobhan, who was going to say a few words along with introduce some of the others and to introduce our speakers today. I'm so excited to have our speakers here to talk about what I think is a really exciting topic, but that's for them and not for me. So I'm going to hand over and switch off my video. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Siobhan, and first of all, I'd just like to say on behalf of Young Animal Lawyers Network, we're so excited to be hosting this event. Like Paula said, it's our first one and it's a great one to start with. So I'm very privileged to say that we have Johanna, Angus, Debbie and Iyan with us today. So I'll be introducing them individually, giving a bit of detail about what they've done, and they'll be speaking about themselves before we then move on to the panel and Q&A part of the evening. So to start with, we have Johanna Gibson. And Johanna is a Herschel Smith Professor of Intellectual Property Law in the School of Law, Queen Mary, University of London, where she teaches and researches in intellectual property, animals and the law, and legal theory and philosophy. Johanna's most recent book, which I'm sure she'll talk about this evening, is the first in a trilogy on her theory of ethological jurisprudence. Now, Johanna has also introduced 2 animal law modules at the Queen Mary LLM programme, and it looks at animals in agriculture, animal law, welfare and trade. The first one looks at animals in agriculture, science and conservation. And the other one, which is animal law, media and culture, considers all aspects of the use of animals in the creative industries. Johanna holds postgraduate degrees in law, animal sciences and the arts.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Today, I think it's really important to certainly to receive your questions and to discuss in questions, but just a little bit about my own background. So, as Siobhan mentioned, I have, as well as law, I also have a postgraduate degree in behavior and ethology, and I sometimes describe it as my sort of sliding doors moment, because it was a decision as to whether to undertake a PhD in science or undertake a PhD in law. And ultimately I pursued law, obviously, but in many respects, I don't think it makes a lot of difference, and it's important to think about why that is the case. As far as my research in animal studies and animal law is concerned, I see a lot of this work as being very interconnected, and I think that is really important to convey in teaching animal law and in researching animal law. So I've explored a lot of the same kinds of questions, and I've drawn upon my study in ethology to assist with that. And I think the interconnectedness is as important to teach as anything else. So this is what I'm doing in my own research, but it's also the way I like to teach animal law to my students. So it's not about an application of the law to the non-human animal subject as such. I mean, obviously we do engage with the law and we look at that, but we try to get engage with the idea that the animal subject before the law is somewhat after the event, if you like. So what we're really trying, or what I'm really trying to do in my research, and what I really try to convey in my modules, is to start thinking about how to animate non-humans from within the law, and so shifting our perspectives on the law. And so what we look at in the modules, but also what I think is important about animal law more widely, is that it's everything from contract to property to intellectual property. And so Siobhan mentioned the book, shameless promotion of the book, but in this I develop a theory of what I call, or an approach of what I call ethological jurisprudence. And what that means is it's not just simply about animals as models or animals as metaphors, or trying to understand how the law has an impact upon the animal, but actually transforming our perspective on the law from within, and using an ethological approach to do that. And so in this in Owned, I look at it very much in terms of property, and property is obviously quite important. Sorry, that's Howard. I'm afraid he really likes Zoom calls, but property is actually really central, not only because this is one of the more contentious areas that we think about when we think about how animals are treated, and certainly the debates of property and personhood, but also at the same time, property is often misinterpreted, or how the impact of property frameworks can be misinterpreted. So I'm trying to use ethology to think through that more relational perspective upon property. And so the misinterpretation, or the application of the law in many respects, can aggravate the problems, and can particularly the idea of thinking about animals and the law as separate, and other areas of law as separate spheres, and really kind of mirroring the sorts of problems of perspective that we see in other contexts. So in Owned, I actually look at the first domestication, and look at a lot of domestication science and zooarchaeology, and to think about how dogs, how that domestication science is how dogs who are widely perceived, accepted as the first domestication, how whatever the dogs did and expressed in that domestication is kind of interpreted as either opportunistic or as a scavenger, rather than looking at the agency of the dogs themselves. And so if you start to shift that perspective, you can start to think about ways that humans were actually domesticated in the process by dogs. And so this kind of rethinking and using an ethological approach then really has important consequences for how we interpret concepts like sociality and morality and property. And so from my own perspective and my own research perspective and in an academic context, so as mentioned in the introductions, there's so much that you can do within an academic context. So for instance, I'm in a graduate law school, so I just teach postgraduates, but I'm also in a Centre for Commercial Law Studies. So you might think, why is animal law in a Centre for Commercial Law Studies? But I think it's actually it's actually really critical and really important. It actually makes a lot of sense. And so for me, the modules, as well as teaching students and introducing students to issues in agriculture and issues in trade and the welfare frameworks and so forth, we're also trying to think through how we interpret cooperation, how we interpret competition, how we interpret territory, rivalry, scarcity and property and so forth in legal frameworks. So what I say to my students when I first meet them is that everything has a dimension for animals. So if you say animal law, I say in terms of understanding animal law, it's like saying I'm going to teach you a module in human law, because there's so much that this connection means that animals are actually very much part of this legal architecture from the outset. So for me, researching in this area, publishing in this area, and teaching in this area is all about changing those perspectives. So this kind of change in perspective, for how we treat and protect animals within the law, but also a change in perspective in the law more widely speaking. So that can be truly transformative and rather than an agonistic approach, if you like. So and for that reason, I find that our discussions of animals then go into some of my other modules as well. So for instance, I teach modules in fashion and film, and we look at the way in which animals and the fashion industry, of course, is a very, I'm very sorry about how, very contentious relationship. And so I've had students who are not pursuing animal law modules, but they are writing about animal law and welfare in their dissertations and so forth. And that really shows for me the importance of that approach of my husband is doing a terrible job. Importance of that approach in no, I wouldn't say mainstreaming, because it's more than that. It's actually overcoming this idea that we have separate spheres, and that I think is really important. So I hope that wasn't too long-winded, Tiffany, and Siobhan, but sort of to try and take you to where animal law sits within a commercial law school. So thank you.
That wasn't too long-winded at all. It was so interesting, and I especially loved what you said about everything has the dimension for animals. I think that's a really good point, and I'm sure we'll have a few questions about that at the end as well. So moving on to Dr. Debbie Rook next. So Debbie is a principal lecturer in law at Northumbria University, and she's lectured there for over 23 years. Previously, she was a property law solicitor at Freshfield Solicitors in London, and in 2003, she set up a module in animal law on the undergraduate law degree. Every year, approximately 40 to 80 students choose to study the module, and she recently completed her professional doctorate titled More Than Human Families in Multi-Species Tenancies, a critical analysis of no pet covenants and the law, and is currently working with a number of external organisations to call for changes in the law that will permit tenants and their pets to live together in rental housing in England. So excited to hear more from Debbie.
Hi, well, thank you, Siobhan, and thank you for inviting me to share with you today my sort of academic pathway into animal law. So as you heard, though, I did a sort of more sort of traditional solicitor route rather than an academic route. So if any of you out there are currently solicitors, you can still get into animal law. And I did my training contract some years ago now with Freshfield, so a big company, commercial law in London, got big offices on Fleet Street. So very, very far away from animal law. But I just felt that wasn't right for me, and I decided to go back into academia. I went to Bristol University and did a master's. And while I was doing the master's, I was doing some teaching as well of trusts law. So I was sort of a graduate tutor. And I really enjoyed that master's. And that sort of made me realize I'd like to get an academic career rather than be in practice. And it can be quite difficult to transition from a practice to an academic career, because you need to have the research, particularly nowadays. A lot of, well, most universities will require you to have a doctorate if they're going to employ you as a solicitor, as a lecturer. So it can be quite hard, but not impossible. So it depends, I think, where you go. So I went to Northumbria Law School, and as I said, this was like 20 years ago. So then they weren't requiring PhDs, and they were quite happy to get people from practice because they had a very practice orientated department. So I went there and I was teaching on the legal practice course. So having that solicitor background was good. So I went to Northumbria in 97, so so 24 years ago. And initially I was teaching property law, land law, both on the LPC and on the LLB. And that was sort of because that was the gap that they had, but also I'd been doing property law in Freshfield. So when I did my training contract, you move around departments. A lot of you probably know this, and you have 6 months in litigation, 6 months in company, 6 months in property. And when I qualified, I went into the property and worked there for 6 months as a qualified solicitor before I moved out and went to academia. So I was at Northumbria teaching land law, and quite happy doing that. And then I came across this book, which is Law Relating to Animals, which was Simon Bruman and Debbie Legg published this in 97, so it's quite an old book now. They are about to do a second edition, which I've been asked to join them, which will be lovely, because this book had a huge impact on me and really got me into animal law. I didn't know animal law existed. I'd never come across it, but I had just at a personal level, I was very passionate about animals, always felt very passionate towards them and felt very strongly against sort of injustice to animals. So when I read this book and realized, I could actually sort of set up a module in animal law, I went to my head of department and asked him if he would let me do that. And luckily he said yes. So that was great. And he gave me a lot of freedom, really. I was just allowed to set up a module. I used the book to sort of help me choose different areas to teach. And then I've been sort of teaching it and refining it every year since I started it, sort of about 18 years ago. So it's now, well, when I started, I was teaching 3rd and 4th year students. And as I say, I had a lot of freedom. I could sort of really teach whatever I wanted. In the last few years, there's been a bit of a change about the program, how we arrange the program. So now I've moved into a 2nd year stream of legal theory options. So now I do a little bit more theory than I did previously, which actually I really enjoy. I mean, previously I did do both a combination of law and ethics, whereas now I do a lot more of the ethical theories. So what I tend to do in my module, it's a 12-week module, so not a lot you can do in 12 weeks, but I try and cram in as much as possible. But we tend to start by looking at the Animal Welfare Act and doing sort of black letter law, because that's what the students are used to. So, we're going through cruelty offence and looking at cases and statutes. And then we apply that to farm animals. And once we get into farm animals, that's where I can bring in the ethical theories. So we're looking at, in particular, Peter Singer. I don't know how many of you have read around different ethical theories around animals, but Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, and Tom Reagan's book, A Case for Animal Rights, are two of the sort of, seminal pieces of work to read for animal law and animal ethics. So we apply some of the ethical theories to the idea of eating meat, and the idea that eating meat is a sort of moral decision. I think that in itself is quite significant to get students aware that it's a moral decision because of the suffering that's involved with factory farming. So I sort of set students a task to go away and look at different animals and find out about the life of a typical pig or a factory farm hen, or in a factory farm, intensive farm, because that's what the majority is, and then they come back and give presentations on that. So it's not me lecturing, they go away and find out for themselves how animals live in factory farms, and that then enables them to appreciate it is a moral decision about eating meat. And then we can use the ethical theories such as utilitarianism, rights theory, social contract theory to sort of analyze this issue of eating meat. Obviously, students come to their own decisions. We're just using that as a way to look at a legal theory and critically analyze it. And then we move on to the sort of legal status of animals, and Stephen Wise's theory of practical autonomy and legal personhood, and all the cases coming out of America on personhood. So there's lots of, 12 weeks isn't long to sort of study animal law. So that's just sort of most of what we do. But I also look at a few other things. In the past, I've looked at animal experimentation. I've also looked at the illegal wildlife trade. So it just depends really what topics are sort of interesting at the time, or in the news at the time. So that's what I've been doing. And in terms of my research, as Siobhan says, I've just completed my doctorate, so I should have Dr. Debbie Rook. I keep forgetting to do that. But so that's great. And that is on looking at no pet covenants, and I'll perhaps talk about that later on if anyone is interested in hearing about that. I will finish there and let the next person speak.
Thank you so much. And I think it's so lovely how it's kind of come full circle, because you'll be helping with the second edition of the book that started it all for you. So that's great. So now moving on to Iyan. Dr. Iyan Offor is a lecturer in law at Birmingham City University. He conducts interdisciplinary theoretical research focusing on global animal law, environmental justice, intersectionality, post-humanism, and law in the Anthropocene. Iyan was previously a Global Research Fellow at the Centre for Animal Law Studies, and he was also a sessional lecturer at the University of Strathclyde and a visiting lecturer at Aarhus University and Lewis and Clark Law School. He has held visiting scholar positions at the Centre for Animal Law Studies and the Global Animal Law section of the Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law. Iyan is an affiliate member of the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance and a member of the Scottish Steering Committee for the UK Centre of Animal Law. So I will hand it over to Iyan.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, and thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. It's a rare talent.
I feel that with a name like Siobhan, don't worry.
Wow, okay, so I'm really excited to be here and to see just how many participants are here today, having followed the evolution of A-law over the last 10 years or so, and seeing just how animal law is growing and how interest in it is growing, and particularly the kind of student involvement. It's really, really exciting. And I think career options are looking slightly better and more optimistic now than they were 10 years ago. So because I'm really at the beginning of my academic career, I've only just secured my first lectureship. My story will be a little bit different to Professor Johanna's and Dr. Debbie's. Debbie, it's fantastic you finished your PhD, and I can't wait to read it. My story's a little bit different, and hopefully it might be able to give you an insight into what immediate steps you might be able to take, what the environment looks like right now for trying to, secure a job in academia, and how you can incorporate animal law into that kind of work. So hopefully that's interesting. First of all, I'll say that I'm not someone who fell into animal law. I think there are a number of people working in animal law. Oh, sorry, just getting some feedback. I think there will be some people who kind of come into animal law accidentally. For me, it was a very sustained and long-term effort, and it took a lot of hard work to be able to actually work in this area. Especially, you know, at the time that I started my law degree, which was in 2011, when comparatively there were a lot fewer opportunities in the area. So I started out going to law school with perhaps a naive hope to make some kind of a difference in the world, make things a little bit better. Quickly realized that most people were at law school for money and power, and it was an environment that wasn't what I was expecting. And I decided pretty quickly that I wanted to pursue issues around environmental law. This is before I knew animal law was a thing. So I went on an exchange year to a university that had some really good environmental law education and research, and that was at the National University of Singapore. And then shortly after that, I discovered A-Law back in 2014 and the really good work they were doing. And they've always had this student-oriented stream of communications about career opportunities. And I think that's a big part of the reason why A-Law has had such an impact and the community continues to grow, which is fantastic. So that kind of opened my eyes to the potential paths that I could go down, which was really exciting. So at that point, I proceeded to ditch the training contract offer that I had because I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and then I realized I didn't want to do that. I realized that academia seemed like a better path because while I was working on my undergraduate dissertation, my dissertation supervisor, I remember this conversation vividly. He was talking about his research. I'd asked what he was working on at the time. And he told me that he'd been thinking a lot about tigers lately, and he thought he would write something about tigers. And it was as simple as that. He just had an idea and he wanted to go and write about it. And I felt that I'd been spending a long time trying to incorporate animals and environmental issues into a legal practice when the freedom of an academic career was staring me right in the face. And I thought, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to try and see if this works and is as good as it looks. So ditched the idea of doing a legal diploma and went for a master's instead. I studied LLM by research, which a lot of people don't know is an option actually. It's kind of like a mini PhD in a sense. It's a year where you're solely doing a personal research project. And this was my opportunity to start using the education I already had in environmental law, international trade, and applying it to the question of the animal. So I started looking at the European institutions and how international trade law was evolving and how that incorporated animal issues and animal welfare. During that time, I started interning with animal welfare NGOs, and that took me to Brussels, where I kind of went on a detour, and I was working in policy for a while, which is a great option for law students. I think the policy-facing work that NGOs are doing is always in need of more lawyers' input, and that's something that you can do as an academic as well. There's lots of ways to kind of work together with NGOs and to either share your expertise or come up with joint projects together and things like that. There's lots of academia is no longer the ivory tower it once was. I think we're all expected to prove impact in the real world, that what we're doing doesn't just stay in our offices or in our universities or classrooms. So that's really exciting as well as challenging in some ways. So at that point, I'd been applying for PhDs because I think someone had mentioned, a PhD is essentially required at this point to pursue a career in academia. So I knew that was what I wanted to do, and it was a further chance to explore my research in animal law. So I did that, maintaining a research partnership with animal welfare NGOs. So I had an outlet for some of that research. And I started working on global animal law, which is I suppose a newly evolving area of animal law, or at least animal legal scholarship. And I've been looking at the interaction between international trade law and global animal law. And I do a lot on legal theory and kind of theories of intersectionality and feminist approaches to animal ethics, and how we can look towards a more critically oriented animal law in the future, which I think is quite interesting. So I chose the university I wanted to do my PhD at based on the expertise there, rather than necessarily university rankings, which might be more important to some of us at undergraduate level. Always better to go for the people you'll be working with when you get to postgraduate level, I think. But because I was working in an environmental law research center, because I was trying to tie animal law and environmental law together, I decided to go and do visiting stays at 2 different animal law research centers. So I went to the Max Planck Institute in Germany, in Heidelberg. They have a global animal law section there that's doing really cool work and research. And I also went to Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon, to work at the Center for Animal Law Studies. And that was a good full circle moment for me because at the time, possibly still, they were the only animal law LLM program in the world. And I had really wanted to go and study there, but it was too difficult to get in with things like fees in the US and stuff. There are a few practical hurdles. A workaround or a cheat to that system, do a PhD and go in as a visiting scholar, and then you can audit some classes for free and maybe even teach. But don't tell them I said that, because they need their students, they need their master's students. Okay, so in the meantime, while I was working on my PhD, there's a number of different things that I was doing, because having a PhD alone is not enough to get a job in academia anymore. And I'm making this sound tough because it is tough, but it is possible. So I was doing a lot of teaching. I was lecturing at my university, the University of Strathclyde, as well as other universities around Europe and in the US. Teaching animal law issues in different courses. So as Debbie was talking, as Johanna was also talking about, animal law is really cross-cutting. It impacts every area of law. So it can be a good opportunity as an animal law academic to kind of insert your expertise into all different kinds of classes. So that's been nice. As well as that, during a PhD, it's kind of expected that you'll do a lot of presenting at conferences and different events, some of them hosted by A-Law, which has been lovely. And also to pursue publications. So to start turning your ideas and your research into writing in academic journals or books, things like that. And finally, I got to actually work for and get employed by the Center for Animal Law Studies in Portland. So again, another kind of full circle moment. I helped them to develop their online animal law LLM, which they've launched this year, which is really exciting. So moving from that point, I started applying for full-time lectureships, and that's how I ended up at Birmingham City University now. I was at once applying for both lectureships and also postdoctoral research positions. A lectureship tends to be broader. There'll be a number of different things expected of you, as Johanna and Debbie will attest to. But you will be expected probably to teach on a number of different courses depending on the kind of contract you have. So it's worthwhile, if you want to work in academia as an animal lawyer, to tie your expertise to other areas as well, to be able to sell yourself as potentially someone who can teach elements of property law. Whether that's through integration of the idea of animals as property, and maybe you expand beyond that. I teach international law, I can teach trade law. You really have to sell yourself as a broader package rather than just focusing on animal law, because nowhere is animal law a required course in a law degree, and it's only an optional course at some universities. And although that is growing, it would still be very difficult to sell yourself to a university as an employer as just an animal law academic. So we have to be a number of things. The other option is postdoctoral research. The issue with that is that funding is very competitive, but animal law increasingly is an area that is attracting funding. So there are opportunities there, which is good. Yeah, so that's really brought me to where I am today, where I'm starting lecturing. I'm continuing my research in animal law and global animal law. I'm working on a number of publications, and the book based on my PhD should be published in the next year or two, depending on how quickly I can turn things around. And on top of that, I want to say a couple of things about the kind of impact you can have as an academic, because our work may not be as direct as working for an animal welfare charity that's impacting policy, or working at an animal shelter and actually doing work on the ground. But we do have the opportunity to make a difference, whether it's in the lives and the minds of students, or impacting policy more indirectly by sharing your research, or being invited as experts to different, whether it's government committees or other kind of processes like that. You'll also be able to and expected to write for not just academic journals and publishers, but also news outlets, and reaching out to the general public and sharing the research that you've done. And it's possible to have an impact that way. So now, looking to the future for me, I'm continuing my research. I'm working more on integrating animal law and environmental law together in different kinds of publications, thinking about multi-species governance for the Anthropocene, thinking about different intersectional approaches to animal issues, and trying to get more recognition in the legal sphere that animal justice is a social justice issue, and trying to tie it together with different social justice issues and thinking about how we can do that. So I'll stop there. That's a bit about my journey. Hopefully that'll be helpful to someone, and I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions.
Thank you so much. And I think it's really inspiring to hear from someone who's perhaps at an earlier stage in their academic career as well. So that's lovely. And lastly, we have Dr. Angus Nurse. So Dr. Angus is the head of criminology and criminal justice at Nottingham Trent University, and he holds a PhD in criminality and criminal justice policy from Birmingham City University, where he studied wildlife crime and the enforcement of wildlife law. His main research interests are in wildlife and environmental crime and the effectiveness of laws protecting animals and wildlife. His work in this area also includes examining the links between animal abuse and interpersonal violence, the use of justice systems to achieve better protection for animals and pursue animal rights, and the better integration of animal crime with mainstream criminal justice. So I'll hand over to Angus.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me. Can you see me? Because right, I can see me now. Okay, hello. Right, well, I'll tell you, I think what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about my journey, which is perhaps slightly different from a few other people's, and then also say a little bit about where you can take things around animal law, because whilst I used to work in a law school, as the introduction said, I'm now in a criminology department. So I think one of the things I'd like to get people to think about is how you can broaden out where you might take your careers, so that you're not necessarily, even within academia, constrained towards just thinking purely in terms of law. Because I've run law courses from within criminology departments, and actually sometimes they do get taken up perhaps a little bit better. As our previous speaker said, you don't always have animal law courses on LLB courses, LM, etc. But increasingly within criminology, we've embraced the notion of green criminology, which includes issues around wildlife crime, animal crime, the links between animal abuse and domestic violence. So my background is I'm probably what you'd call a late starter. I actually did my master's degree first as a mature student whilst working for an environmental NGO. And in this context, mature meant anybody over 23. So I did a master's degree first, then did my PhD, which is in wildlife crime and wildlife law. And in fact, I was working for an NGO as a temp, and was going to leave to then go to law school. And they effectively said to me, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I'd like to work in environmental advocacy, environmental investigations, environmental protection. And they said to me, are you likely to get a better job than the one you have now? And I realized that actually I might not, if what I wanted to do was to work for an NGO, because I was working for one of the largest environmental NGOs in Europe. So they paid for me to do my master's degree and then made me stay for a couple of years afterwards. Otherwise, I'd have had to give the money back. So my route was through being in an NGO, having them pay for that work, that qualification, and then thinking that part of what I wanted to do was to do research, advocacy, and activism, particularly in the area of wildlife crime. And wildlife law was one aspect of animal law. And so I did my PhD then. And part of the reason for actually leaving the NGO was that my PhD potentially would have brought me into conflict with them. So that I might have been in a position where I was either critiquing their policy or suggesting that their understanding of UK wildlife law and its importance perhaps didn't match the reality of what was out there. And so that's one of the potentially the negative aspects if you're working for an organization who might say, okay, well, we want you to work on this, but I knew I wouldn't be able to say anything that at all suggested that one part of wildlife crime was not the most important policy priority. So on that basis, I left and did my PhD there. Did my PhD at Birmingham City University. I became a full-time academic in around 2009, initially working in the law school at the University of Lincoln. And as our previous speaker said, although I was doing some work around, if you are going to work for a university, you might have to consider teaching other things other than your specialism. So my intention was to only teach environmental law and animal law. And then between me accepting the job and starting, somebody left, and I was asked if I would teach constitutional law, but asked in a way that suggested I didn't really have the option of saying no in the nicest way possible. So sometimes at universities, you end up having to fill certain gaps, and you may have a specialism, but you might want to think, particularly in the area of animal law, when you're researching your universities, look at the ones who either have an animal law specialism within their courses, or consider, I interview a lot of people and for jobs, and especially in criminology, we find that we ask people, what is the course you would like to offer? What do you think you can add to our program? And if somebody wants to do something around green criminology and animal law, if I'm on the panel, they stand a strong chance of getting the job, I would suggest. But it's not the same everywhere, and universities vary. My experience of universities, I joined my current university back in April. So I spent 8 years at my previous university. But again, one of the things that I found in criminology is because criminology courses are perhaps not so constrained as law courses, because they don't have the same sort of regulatory structures as you find on an LLB or well, GDL or equivalent programs are set. Certainly within each university I've been at, I've been able to go in and say, I want to run a green criminology course that looks at wildlife crime, that looks at animal law and its effectiveness. And each university I've been at, I've been able to integrate that within the system because of the flexibility. At my last university, I was at Middlesex University for 8 years, we actually introduced a complete new degree, Masters in Environmental Law and Justice. And as the title probably suggests, it's all about environmental law. So we had green criminology modules, we had a module about environmental policy and ethics that looked at things like European animal law, European environmental law, and so on. We had a postgraduate green criminology module that worked quite well. And at my current institution, even though I only joined in April, in July I was able to run a summer school course as an introduction to criminology. Sorry, Introduction to Green Criminology and Environmental Crime. That's not what it was called. Introduction to Environmental Crime and Wildlife Crime. That's what it was called. I think one of my students might be present in this talk, so I better correct it to make sure I get the details right. And again, within the structure of that university setting, I was able to basically devise a course from scratch and have it offered in a relatively short period of time. As I say, I arrived in April, the course ran for the first time over the course of a week in July. So there is that flexibility. In relation to the type of work that you're able to do, I think I would echo what the previous speaker said. Certainly within my area, I've had quite a lot of freedom to construct publications and construct research. So my PhD was turned into 2 books, one that looked at the reasons why people harm and kill animals, and a second one that was around the enforcement of particularly wildlife law. And within the confines of my role, I'm encouraged to publish. And whilst you might be restricted or encouraged to teach in various areas, as far as publications are concerned, I've pretty much been left alone to publish whatever I like, presumably as long as I don't somehow bring the university into disrepute. But I've been able to publish books, publish journal articles. I've also been encouraged within my role to do work that attracts funding. So I've done work looking at links between animal abuse and domestic violence. I've had some funded projects on that. I've had funded projects on dangerous dogs legislation, funded by the government. I think I'm okay to say that. I think it's in the public domain. And also, when one of the things that you are encouraged to do as academics is, dependent on the university you're at, a certain proportion of your work will be teaching, but a certain proportion of your work will be around research activity, kind of broadly defined in terms of bringing in research money, publishing research publications, and kind of adding to the research input of the university and outputs of the university. So I've been at that for about 10 years. And I think one of the other things that I get to do quite a lot of is I get to go and do guest lectures on animal law at different universities. And I probably do 4 or 5 of these a year. Well, pre-COVID, I probably did 4 or 5 of these a year. I think I've done 3 or 4 online ones in the last year. But a regular part of my work would be going out and doing those. And then I'll just wrap up by also saying the other thing that I do quite a bit of work on is both encouraging people to do PhDs and working with people on PhDs. But I also have examined a number of PhDs on animal law and wildlife crime. I think in part because it's a niche field, I can probably think there's maybe 6 or 7 people who will regularly get called on to do those kind of PhD examinations. And sometimes we end up on the same panels as well. So, I mean, I think one of the things that I would say that I think is good about contemporary universities, and particularly at this particular time, research in universities in the UK is essentially assessed for its quality on a 5-year cycle. There's a thing called the Research Excellence Framework. We've just had the last Research Excellence Framework. We're now in the new cycle that started on sometime in January 2021. So I think over the course of the next couple of years, certainly in criminology, probably in law as well, people will be looking for people to join universities to build up their research capacities. So this is quite a good time to be applying to universities. I will stop there. How have I done for time?
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for your presentations. As I'm sure everybody will agree, it was very interesting to learn about all of your different journeys into animal academia. We are now going to move on to our Q&As for the evening. So pending timings, we will then open the floor to the audience for Q&As. We will try to leave some time at the end for that. So if you could please make sure that you're popping your Q&As into the Q&A box and not into the general chat. And just to make sure to, if you want to direct it to a specific speaker, just to put their name in the beginning so we know. So let's begin with our first question that we have to the speakers. It seems to be that there is a growing interest in animal academia. Where do you see this field heading in the future? Do you think it could become a mainstream area? Does anybody want to go first? Angus? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say within some areas, I would suggest it actually has gone pretty much mainstream already. Certainly, when I first started 10 years ago, you would see very little by way of publishing around animal issues, around green criminology, around animal law in that way. And this is a shameless plug. I run a book series for Paul Grave Macmillan with one scholar from the United States and one scholar from Australia, so it's truly international. And we've published works by people in China on wildlife crime and so on. That would have been almost unthinkable when I first started full time. And we're not the only book series. There's another book series on I think it's animal ethics, run by Jenny Mayer and Piers Byrne, and I think that's with Emerald. There's a green criminology book series with Routledge as well. So there are at least 3 book series I'm aware of. Oh, and I forgot there's an animal ethics series with the University of Chicago. No, that's not right. I'll double check that. I think it's the University of Chicago Press, and it's run by Andrew Lindsay out of Oxford University's Theology Department. So there's a whole range of areas where it is possible to kind of publish and work, and it's an accepted area of scholarship now in a way that it was perhaps more fringe when I started 10 years ago. So I see that growing. We see demand for courses. I probably receive something between 10 and 20 PhD applications a year, or queries about people doing PhDs in particular areas of animal law. So I hope these won't be famous last words, but I've seen it stabilize a bit, and I think it's growing.
Yeah, I think Angus is right. It is growing, but I do think in the UK with animal law in law schools, there aren't that many law schools that do teach a module in animal law. So it would be lovely to see that growing. But I think just generally animal law is growing internationally, particularly in America. It's huge now. So hopefully, you know, we will follow. But when I started, I set mine up back in 2003. There were literally only sort of 2 or 3 courses, and now there are a lot more. So it definitely is growing. I'm not sure it'll ever be sort of mainstream, but I actually think, I think that the big issue now is going to be climate crisis. So I think that environmental law is going to be massive in a few years' time, and I think animal law can come into that as part of environmental law, which Iyan will know all about that. That's his area. But I think, that's something I keep thinking about for my module. I'd like to bring in sort of climate issues and how they affect animals, and the links there. So I think that will grow, and it could be that animal law will sort of come in on the side of that. One thing I've noticed as well in the sort of 20 odd years I've been teaching this is that sort of 20 odd years ago, it was really rare to come across people who were vegetarian or vegan. And I remember, my students at that time were sort of like, wow, you're a vegetarian, they were really surprised. Whereas now it's a big thing, isn't it? But I think it's more about environmental issues. That's where it's coming from. And people having a sort of meat-free day because of the climate crisis. So it could be that that animal sort of law and animal ethics will grow as a result of the importance of the climate crisis and the links between them.
If I could just follow on, yes, I'd agree that it's not, in many respects, it's still viewed as a niche area, and as Debbie's pointed out, it's actually quite rare to see it in undergraduate programs. So I was quite lucky because I have a lot of flexibility in a postgraduate program to introduce the LLM modules, and with a view to hopefully setting up an animal law LLM. But I think some of it is also the perspective on animal law from students coming to university. So one of the first questions in the Q&A, if I could just quickly address it now, which is whether we could expand on the connections between commercial law and animal law. So why is animal law in a commercial law program? It's actually, it was first approved in commercial law and international business law because of the interaction with trade, as Iyan has pointed out as well, that it is very much a part of trade, teaching trade principles, and also understanding how these things come within European competences, precisely because of that commercial and trade aspect. And so but it's also other areas. So for instance, I teach protective belief and ethical veganism in a lecture in fashion law, because it's looking at dealing with customers and the retail context, and so not only the animals that are used in fashion, but also as Debbie pointed out, that the change in or the perceived more usual what am I trying to say? The rising population of veganism and vegetarianism, but also looking at it though, not simply as people don't want to, they want to have a meat-free day, or they don't want to have as big an impact on the environment, but actually looking at it from the perspective of this is a protected belief. There's people approaching it in that way. So not a lifestyle, not anything else, and then that becomes part of that retail context. And it's just a really, you know, at first you think, gosh, you know, what's animal law got to do with commercial law? But it actually has so much to do with commercial law, and as Angus pointed out, you know, mainstreaming it is really about getting people aware of why these things are issues in day-to-day life, so not just a niche area. And so the two animal law modules at QM, they're approved on the commercial law stream, and that they're also approved on IP, because in animal law, welfare and trade, we look at patents, and we look at patents as an animal research, and patents as a possibility for having a welfare context, and how you might start to think about how to use these other areas of law in a welfare frame. And similarly in media law, media and culture, obviously we're looking at media and media law, and it's approved on the media law stream, but we're looking at things like social media strategy and laws and regulations around the use of social media, and then that has an impact on exotic pet trade. So there are always these connections, and I think what I've been trying to do is really impress that upon students that are coming in, that this isn't a niche area. This is actually really important, and if they really want to stand out from the crowd of LLMs out there, then they should be starting to think about these innovative approaches to their curriculum. Sorry, I went on that. I'm really passionate about this.
I'll add a little bit to this. I think it's all really interesting. First of all, I agree with Angus that I think animal law already is big. I think it already is verging on mainstream. All of the publication series, the conference series, they're all there already. And we're seeing it increasingly being taught, advocated all over the world. So in a sense, I agree, it is there. I think the change and the kind of evolution of it is going to come about through better connections with thinking about governance for the Anthropocene age, dealing with all of the crises that we are currently, whether it's the climate crisis or species extinction or all these kinds of events. If we're starting to think about the role of law in society and questioning that, which I think we are in some circles, thinking about the non-human is central to that. Thinking about the role and the relationship of law with non-humans and what we want law and need law to do, you know, that has to change. So in a sense, I think in the same way that the world and the way we organize ourselves has to change, the way that we think about the law's connection with non-humans has to change as well. So I think that it's going to be a necessity over time. Thinking, you know, very practically speaking, in terms of, you know, our lifetime, the next 10 years, how are things going to change? If we're thinking about, you know, opportunities to become an animal law academic, which I suppose is why we're here today and trying to talk to people about what options are available. it's difficult because the kind of core offerings of law schools typically center around what is required by the law societies. So again, Angus was talking about the greater freedom, teaching something like criminology. You don't have those restrictions there. And unless those requirements change, animal law is not required for something like that. So the kind of core offerings, especially as universities are becoming more pressured to produce, to make money and save money as well, there are challenges there. But going back to the question of research, there is more and more research funding that is going to animal law research and animal ethics research and stuff. So I think there's lots of reasons to be hopeful.
Thank you so much for those answers. They were just so interesting and insightful. I have a next question for you guys. I think maybe we've touched on this slightly before, but just see if there's any further thoughts on it. How do you think that academics can influence animal protection law?
If I may, just very quickly, there was a question that's kind of related to that, which is if you can combine legal practice and academia, and you absolutely can, and that is one area, of course, in which you'd have influence. For instance, so I often give what are called opinions and so forth in legal cases, but I also am an expert member of the Animals and Science Committee, which is the Home Office committee that it's independent, non-governmental. It is a committee that scrutinizes what's happening and is the oversight for what is happening and advises the minister, and it's things like that, that your expertise is going to be found in lots of different areas, and these are the places where you can actually make quite a bit of difference, and certainly in the ASC, for instance, we think very widely about what needs to change and how it can change and so forth, and it's quite a challenging job, if you like. It's quite a challenging committee to be on, but I think it's really important that we are in those places and that we are trying to really bring the best research and practice into those kinds of contexts. That's just my personal experience, but I think absolutely you can combine and have an impact in those ways.
Yeah, I can add to this as well. I guess I have direct experience of this because I did my PhD kind of in partnership with animal welfare NGOs. So I had a direct outlet for the research I was producing, and that went on to impact policy in a number of different ways. And as Johanna was speaking about, there's a number of opportunities to get involved with policy making at different governmental levels. There's a number of academics within the A-Law network who are working with government committees that are working on animal law issues in the UK right now. And on top of that, I suppose, as I was mentioning earlier, academia isn't really the ivory tower anymore. We're all expected to be having an impact in the outside world. It kind of comes with the territory now. So it's almost part of the job description that we have to be proving that what we do matters and that we're having an impact on the societies around us. And on top of that, I think one of the key impacts we can have is on our students and on the schools and the courses that we're actually teaching on, because that has a massive ripple effect. If you think just introducing an animal law issue, even in another course, if you just have a session, or you introduce this idea that, maybe we should be thinking about non-humans too and how the law affects them, that can trigger things in hundreds of, if not thousands of students' minds. And if there are a handful of us working in law schools, sharing those ideas, then the potential effect of that's massive. So I think that's kind of a key impact that academics can have that we sometimes forget about. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree definitely with that. I think, sometimes we focus a little bit too much on what research is going to do, but really we're educators as well. That's a key part of our job. And I think that's sort of, for me, one of the most sort of fulfilling aspects of my job is to think about all the students that over the 18 years that I've been teaching animal law, I've introduced them to the idea of animal ethics and them thinking about animals in a way that they wouldn't have done, they hadn't done before, and it was new to them. And I've had so many students come back to me at the end and say, this was the best module they'd ever done. It really changed the way they saw things, which they'd never, saw the world in a way they hadn't before, to suddenly see all the sort of injustice that goes on to animals that we just do without thinking about, such as factory farms or experimentation, and suddenly they'd become aware of that. It sort of opened their eyes to that. So I think as educators, you can have a massive impact on students who, who knows what, well, the ripple effect, I suppose, that you were just talking about there. The other things, for example, I teach is pet custody disputes, which is something that is relatively sort of new area in the UK. And I think a few years ago, when I first started researching it, this is the idea of, where a couple split up and they both want to keep the family dog. And a few years ago, judges were sort of saying, no, we're not, and lawyers were sort of saying, we're not going to consider this. These are dogs, we're not going to consider who gets to keep the dog. Whereas now it's becoming more mainstream within sort of solicitors, family solicitors, that people are sort of disputing who's going to get the dog. It is an issue as solicitors and lawyers are becoming aware of this, realize how important it is to people that their pets, their dogs are family to them. By teaching this to my students over the last sort of about 8 years I've been teaching pet custody disputes, it means when they get out there and become family lawyers or hopefully judges in the future, it's something they've already come across, they're aware and they're sympathetic to the issue. So yeah.
There's a really, I agree with Debbie, and I often think about, we always talk about research-led teaching, but I think we should also talk about teaching-led research, because there are often such stimulating discussions in the classes that it really is a really mutually stimulating experience, just debating some of these issues with students. But one of the other entry points into academia at the moment, which is also quite relevant to the discussion of teaching, is there's a proliferation of opportunities right now, is in teaching and scholarship appointments, which means that you don't have a research requirement. You are teaching, full-time teaching. Now they're normally in some mainstream but core modules, core areas, such as tort and property and contract and so forth. But there's a lot of them around at the moment, and there's no reason that can't also be a path of interest to you. So it may be that you would prefer, and perhaps this is also relevant to practitioners seeking to enter into academia, that teaching and scholarship appointments are also a really good option. And there's a lot of them around at the moment because everybody opened up their doors during COVID, and everyone's over recruited. So there's like thousands of students about to arrive, and there's lots of opportunities there. But that said, it may be that you want to think down the line that maybe you want to move into research, but there's nothing wrong with doing teaching and scholarship, and also just having a chance to just join an academic department and see what it's like and experience and do some of that teaching. And it's kind of, there are a lot of questions about what types of areas you need to focus in order to move into animal law. And I actually think that there isn't a particular area. All four of us have come from different areas. Debbie and I are the closest possibly because I'm IP and she's property, but Iyan trade and environmental law, Angus green criminology and environmental, but we're all coming from different areas. But as everyone has said, and as Iyan has said, sorry, I did that, I'm sorry. As Iyan has said, I've gone blank. that you do need to teach some of these other modules, and that would be an expectation. So I think that's an important point. And most entry-level positions, you would be required to teach a core module, but that goes for anything. If you're going in with environmental law, you'll probably still be asked to teach tort. If you're going in with IP, you're probably still going to be asked to teach contract or something like that. One area I think that is quite useful though would be jurisprudence, if it's something that you're looking at. But in terms of your journey there, I think it can be, there are so many different paths. So that would be my point there.
Thank you all very much. Our next question, we've kind of touched on it throughout all the other questions, but feel free to comment if you like, and then I'll ask you the next question at the same time. So if you want to discuss any impact you think you've had on your students, please feel free to comment on that further. And next question would be, is there any advice that you would give to somebody beginning their journey into academia, whether they're still studying or that they've graduated? So either the impact or advice.
One piece of advice I can share, I was reading a number of blogs about doing a PhD in law before I started, and the best piece of advice that I read was born of cynicism perhaps, but it was really useful. It said that the only good reason to do a PhD is because you are so passionate about the subject that you're going to study that you will be able to sustain yourself thinking about that one thing for however many years you're doing your PhD. Do not go into a PhD hoping for a job, because you might not get one. That's the reality. And don't go into a PhD for, they also said don't go into it because you think it will make you look more employable. I don't know if that's true. I think there is wider recognition useful in practice now as well, but I really stand by that advice that you should go into it because you are passionate about it, because there is no way to know where it will lead you, and you need that passion to kind of drive you through on those first steps of the journey.
I second that. I think that's excellent advice. And also when you're constructing your research question, when you're thinking about what you want to research, don't try and think, well, this topic is going to make me more interesting or more, just do what you're passionate about. Absolutely. That's really, really good advice.
I'm just going to jump in and also let the attendees know in the Q&A, you can now vote up questions. So if there's a question there that you would like to have answered, it will help us as well pick at the end of the panel questions.
Okay, we've got our final question for the speakers. What are you working on now?
Induction weeks.
Yeah, staffing problems.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been quite an interesting year for academia, but yes. Well, me personally, I'm working on expanding the idea of ecological jurisprudence to the objects of property themselves. So looking at it in the context of the products of intellectual property. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, as well as other stuff. But I am actually what's also interesting about this area is, for instance, I've just contributed to a property handbook, one of those big reference handbooks, but I was asked to do it on animals and property. And so it's really interesting to work with a range of property scholars and looking at different perspectives, but looking at animals in that context. And so you will find that you're going to be working in lots of different areas.
Hi, well, I suppose what I'm trying to do at the moment in terms of research is to work to sort of develop the work I've been doing in my doctorate. So that's around no pet covenants. So this is the idea of, you know, tenants going into residential property and there's a covenant in the lease that says they can't take their dog or cat with them. In part of my research was interviewing people who'd had to have their pets rehomed, or they'd I spoke to a homeless person who hadn't gone into accommodation, into shelter, because he wasn't allowed to take his dog with him. So this is something that's a really big issue. I'm very passionate about it, which is what, like Ian said, that's got me through my doctorate, because I feel so passionate about it. I'm at the moment sort of working with a number of animal organisations and ALAW as well, and we're trying to bring a campaign for changes in legislation that will allow tenants to have their pets with them in residential property, private landlord owned residential property. So that's sort of really sort of exciting, and I've got lots of articles that I'd like to write from that, but it is about time. And I think for anyone who's interested in coming into academia, I just want to make this one point, is that I really enjoy my job. I'm glad I've done this career, but it is hard work. And it is very demanding, because you are sort of a teacher, a researcher, and an administrator. And often you're trying to do lots of different things at once. And so it's not that any one of them is too difficult or too challenging, it's just that they're all hitting you at once and you've got loads of deadlines. And yeah, so it is a challenging job. It's an enjoyable and rewarding job. You have a lot of autonomy, which I think, you know, I personally have really enjoyed that. But it is a demanding job, lots of different things that you're trying to do, lots of deadlines. No one person really knows all the different things that you're doing apart from yourself. So you haven't got like one line manager who knows everything you're doing, because you're working with different people in teaching, to who you work with in research, to who you work with admin. So it is, you know, there's lots of different demands. And so it is a job where I think you have to be quite careful about not working too hard, because it's not a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday job. If you want a job like that, don't become an academic. But I think you do have to make sure you make space for yourself, take holidays, take weekends, you know, don't work all hours. And if you're someone who's a perfectionist, who think you will have to do everything perfect, then again, I don't think it's particularly a good job, because you'll probably burn yourself out trying to do everything really, really well. So it's a great job, really rewarding job, but just be aware of the sort of challenges.
Yeah, I would second all of that. It is very demanding. It's worth it in a number of ways, but it does require a lot of you, a lot of time and attention. So in line with Johanna's comment, my time at the moment is largely induction week. We're busy with that, and all of the students are arriving on campus and also dealing with the stress of apparently doing in-person teaching, which is a thing now. So the day-to-day struggles are, we get to do this cool research that happens in the background, but the day-to-day job can be quite different sometimes. So yeah, figuring out the teaching for the semester. I'm currently bringing back a course to Birmingham City University on human rights in the environment, which I'm tweaking to make about the environment and animals and human rights and how all of that comes together, and hopefully building a course in animal law if I have the time for the next year or potentially the year after that. And some research continues happening in the background. I mentioned that my book was picked up by Routledge, so that will hopefully be out in the next year or two. It will be called, or at least at the moment, it's going to be called Global Animal Law from the Margins, the International Trade in Animals and Their Bodies. Excuse me, non-human animals and their bodies. So something like that, and a few other publications as well. I'm desperately trying to start a research blog where I will try to encourage more engagement from non-Western practitioners, scholars, individuals who want to be more engaged in animal law and particularly global animal law, and trying to make the pathways into having an impact there more accessible to more people.
Yeah, I'd echo everything that the other speakers have said. I think I'd also add, I think one of my pieces of advice would be, if you do go into academia, in addition to all the things about not working all the time, learn to say no, because it's very easy to agree to too many projects and then just find yourself constantly overloaded, or with, you know, constant deadlines and things like that that you may find difficult to sort of meet. I had noble aspirations of doing a research blog. I'm now in my 3rd year of not doing the thing I set out to do, and I don't see me having time in this coming year. But Ian's kind of encouraged me to think I should get out there and do it. In terms of things that I'm working on, back in 2003, when I was a PhD student at what was then the University of Central England, I believe, what's now Birmingham City University, I did a kind of audit of wildlife law and wildlife crime in the UK as part of my PhD. I'm about to embark on a project updating that, looking what the current state of wildlife law is in the UK, and how kind of wildlife crime issues are dealt with, and sort of trying to identify things like the remaining loopholes that might still be in wildlife law and those kind of things, and also how we are potentially affected by Brexit. So as I say, something I did back in 2003, I'm about to sort of embark on kind of updating that piece of work. The other thing, which I think backs up some of what I've said, is I'm also finishing off a book on corporate environmental crime for an American publisher, which I believe is now technically about a year overdue. So that's going through its kind of production processes at the moment. So that's one of the pieces of work that I'm doing. Yeah, that's about it, I think. And trying not to commit to too many additional projects that will kind of stack up and circle my desk like planes looking for a landing spot.
Thank you so much to all of you for answering our panel questions, and I'm really glad to say that we have a few minutes left to answer some audience Q&As. So I'll hand over to Connie to ask the first one.
Thank you, Siobhan. So we've got one for Ian. Hannah says, Ian mentioned potentially bypassing masters and going straight for a PhD. It would be good to hear more about that in terms of how you would approach this, etc.
Sorry, grappling for the unmute button. Hi, Hannah, good to see you here. Hannah's doing loads of cool stuff at the moment, so awesome to hear that you're thinking about trying to get into a master's as well. Did I talk about bypassing a master's? What I did was I bypassed a taught master's and I did a master's by research. And you were talking, let me see. So one, I think I'd seen a mention of questions about funding and stuff. One of the attractions of master's by research was that the fees were lower. It is a more accessible option, and you also have the freedom to kind of research animal law. But with it being a research degree, there's less guidance than there would be in a taught degree. Yeah, it is tricky. Bypassing a master's and going straight to a PhD is possible, but it can be difficult. And getting PhD funding can be difficult. It's one of those places where, and I hate saying this because I hated this advice when I was looking for options, but you do genuinely just have to be creative. I ended up having a PhD scholarship that was part funded by the university I did my PhD at, and part funded by animal welfare NGOs, because there was a specific stream that required external partnerships, and it was less competitive because they were harder to secure. I don't know if that goes any way to answering the question, but there are a few different kind of avenues to doing that.
Yeah, you can do an MRes at quite a lot of universities. We have an MRes, but and you can kind of develop your PhD from that, but it is usually it's a very clear development from it. You're not turning the MRes into a PhD, so you're still doing a master's. At least that's how it is where we are.
Great.
Okay,
Oh, sorry, Connie.
oh no, you go, Siobhan. It's fine.
I was just going to look at the next most upvoted answer, a question rather, which is from Aditi, who asks, how should the resume of an undergrad law student who aspires to pursue an LLM in animal law look like?
That sounds awful, but you should have at least a 2-1, and that's really all that matters. All that an LLM looks at is how you did in your undergrad and whether you can get in. In many respects, a lot of what you have on your seat in terms of your individual modules doesn't matter as much, depending on jurisdictions where you want to go into academia or where you want to go into practice. Something that is quite useful though, if you're on your undergraduate dissertation, for instance, you might then focus on animal law. So although so at QM we don't have animal law in the undergrad yet, but I think it's on its way. So I've had undergrads audit the LLM modules, and then they've done their dissertations in animal law, and they've had supervision for that. And similarly with the LLM students have done dissertations in animal law. I don't know if that completely answers the question, but the main thing is really they're just going to look at what your LLB looks like. Which is a very uninspiring answer, I know.
I'd also say maybe because there aren't many of these programs out there, reach out to them directly. So I mentioned that I was interested in doing the LLM with Lewis and Clark Law School, the Center for Animal Law Studies. I maintain contact with them since I first reached out in 2015, and it took 7 or 8 years, but I finally got there through a different path. So make those personal connections, because you know they can end up getting you where you want to be through indirect routes sometimes.
Yeah, I think I just agree with Ian there about making personal connections, particularly because animal law is quite a small community, so it can be quite easy to sort of make connections. So for some of the A-Law conference, obviously it was online this year, but a couple of years ago it was in Liverpool, and lots of students came, and it was great to sort of talk to them and for them to make contact with academics and solicitors. So, you know, I would encourage you to sort of attend events when we're not online through A-Law and sort of make connections, because that's a great way.
Okay, shall we ask just one more perhaps? I know that we're just at 8. I'm so sorry, there's so many questions we can't get to. There's one about funding. I know, Ian, you just briefly touched on funding for yours, but does anybody have any advice, tips, or secrets for securing funding for master's or PhD?
Yeah, I'll go on that one. I think you might need to look at universities and see what kind of schemes they run. I got a bursary for my PhD, which I will be honest was a factor in my choosing to go where I went to do my PhD, because Birmingham City had a bursary scheme so you could apply for a bursary once you're accepted as a student. I think that's probably the more accurate way to put it. So I think part of it will be about having a look at what's available at your universities. For most universities, I think in the UK, if you are a continuing student, you'll probably be able to get some sort of alumni discount. So you might not necessarily get funded, but you might get a discount on fees, or at least a partial discount on fees. So that's worth looking at. There are some universities who will offer funded PhD places if somebody's able to get a project up and running. I have not yet been able to get a funded green criminology PhD. I refuse to give up. I will keep going until I get one and can offer a funded PhD to somebody. There are, I think the other thing is when they will come in to the cycle is also something to keep an eye on. As I said earlier on, we're at the beginning of a research cycle, so you may find that there are PhD bursaries and scholarships being offered now. so that people can count them in terms of their research culture and their research department within the next kind of 5 years, hopefully. So yeah, so have a look at the universities you're interested in and see what they offer. There are some schemes available.
Yeah, and then to add to that, the next step, if there's not much luck with the universities you're looking at, is generally research councils. So for law, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, or the Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC, or other potential funding sources. We used to have the Marie Curie, but I don't think that we can get access to that post-Brexit now. But there are lots of different funding bodies. I think some websites that are useful are like Find a Master's or Find a PhD. They often have good advice about finding funding. Some universities will have specific advice as well. I had another thought, but I can't remember what it was. So that's it.
Yeah, I'd just say that agreeing with Ian, really, to have a look for websites for find PhDs. So Northumbria University, a couple of years ago, we did, well, it must have been 3 years ago, we did 2 full paid scholarships for 2 students who have been studying, who've been doing their PhDs in an area of animal law. So it's been, you know, that's been great, and they're about to submit their PhDs. So, and that was, you know, they're funded and they get a maintenance as well. It's a really good deal. So there will be deals out there with different universities. It's just finding them.
Thank you. We've just got one last question, if that's okay with the speakers. How do you all maintain your mental well-being working in this area? This is an anonymous question. They said, I sometimes get overwhelmed on my course, human-animal interaction, when I have to research and write about different areas where animals are exploited, and I wonder how you all cope with this. Oh, just one final thing, sorry. If obviously, as our last question, if any of the speakers are happy to put their email into the chat, and then if there's any questions left over, they could direct them to you if you're happy to do that.
Yeah, I think that is a really, really good question about how you deal with it mentally. And I suppose everyone's going to have their own way of dealing with it. I think when I see animal cruelty, it tends to make me angry rather than upset. So that actually motivates me to want to make changes and to sort of, you know, educate people about animals, but also, you know, bring changes in the law. So in some ways, I think, you know, it can be quite a good way of motivating me. But there are occasionally I've seen some about a year ago, I saw a really awful video on YouTube, and I was so upset. I mean, I was crying, I was sort of sobbing, but yeah, and there was no, it was something that was happening in a different country. There was no way I could have you know, had a change, made it have any difference to what was going on. So I think sometimes you just have to accept that you can't, you know, you can't do everything, and just sort of yeah, just the same when you see things in the news as well, that not animal but human, you know, you realize your limitations and you can feel upset by it, but accept that you can't change that, but try and make changes to what you can do, and then that will help you feel like you're actually doing something positive.
Yeah, I'd also add that we're only human, and sometimes you just need to avoid it. Take a break from Twitter, take a break from YouTube, just don't look. You know, we're all working in this area, so we know how serious it is and we all care. In a way, those videos aren't there for us. They're for the people who don't care yet, and we're trying to encourage to care. So sometimes you do need a break, and that maybe that's not the healthiest way if that's dealing with it through avoidance, but the alternative is becoming desensitized, which I don't want either. And then on top of that, just do all of the things we should all be doing anyway, practicing mindfulness and looking after ourselves and taking breaks away from work, you know, whatever work it is that we're doing.
Yeah, and I think I'd add, because you can't do everything, and I think it's quite hard to accept that you can't do everything. You know, I have a backlog of research projects, policy papers and things that I would have loved to have written that I'm probably not going to get round to, just with the demands of everything else I'm doing. So I think the other things that I would say is, talk to like-minded people. I will obviously note everybody's email addresses so I can reach out for assistance. But also think about, it can be quite hard, but sometimes you have to kind of prioritize the things that you want to work on and the things that are really important to you. It's similar to Ian's advice about the PhD. Think about the things that are important, the things that you would regret not doing, and kind of maybe look at those first, and give them some kind of priority. And I think one of the things that everybody's got their different ways of coping with things, but I think if you're doing the things that you want to do, then hopefully that will make your life a little bit easier, even if you don't get around to everything that you would ideally like to do. So I think sometimes that's quite important. Don't overcommit yourself. Be realistic about what you want to do. Try and prioritize the things that you'll just regret if you don't do them, because you at times you're going to have lots of different balls in the air: admin, teaching, trying to get research done, supporting students. I don't think anybody's mentioned marking yet, but marking is the bane of my life, and can at certain times of the year can just dominate everything that you're doing, depending on where you work, obviously, in your workloads and things. So there are things that you kind of just have to get used to kind of managing. So yeah.
Yeah, as always, Angus's advice is excellent. I remember actually my first job, my head of department said, you have to learn how to say no. And this has followed me ever since. And when Angus said that, I went, yes, that is the best advice of all. And prioritizing things that way is really important. And also what you said, Angus, about like-minded people, I think, the sorts of things that we end up having to teach or look at or grapple with in the animal law modules can sometimes be quite harrowing, although a lot of it we describe rather than necessarily look at, but you're dealing with some sort of potentially quite harrowing times, or people are coming with their own research interests, and what you said, Angus, about like-minded people, I think that's what's actually very good about the animal law modules, is that we are all kind of focused on this, on similar goals, and they're smaller classes than, although they the last lot was quite big. The last one was 24, but normally there's sort of half a dozen students, so we are really focused on the questions. We have a few auditors, so maybe there's 10 people in the room and we're having a really close and interesting discussion, and that really makes it, you're motivated by it. I'm motivated by the student feedback and talking to the students and exploring these issues with the students, and also kind of reassured and strengthened by it, because it is a lot of these things that a lot of these areas that we're looking at can actually be very challenging and exhausting mentally. So I probably just scared everyone off my modules now, but it's not quite like that. But I mean, in the area of animal law, as Debbie pointed out, yes, I mean, I remember when I was teaching BSL, I thought, okay, this is the class I'm going to cry in class. This will be a first for me, but these are quite complex issues, and so but in the class situation, you get a lot of support from each other and really taking on the challenges together, so that helps as well. But yes, I reiterate, learn how to say no.
Thank you, everyone, for your answers, and just thank you again for coming along to the event this evening and speaking. We're incredibly grateful, and I'm sure all of our attendees feel the same as well. I am sorry that we've run over a few minutes, but I think that last question was a really great one to hear about. So yeah, and I would just like to once again say thank you on behalf of Young Animal Lawyers Network for coming to our first event. Very exciting. And now I'd just like to pass back to Paula.
Oh, thank you very much. I mean, what a fantastic launch event, and it shows how popular and how important this topic is for so many people. I mean, the Q&A, I haven't seen it so active at an A-Law event for some time, and there are still unanswered questions. It's really fantastic. Lots of people really keen. We will circulate details, contact details for the Young Animal Lawyers Network after this event. And we do also now have a where to study page on our website, which has details of postgraduate and undergraduate modules and courses, and Angus's summer school and other summer schools. So do have a look at that. We've just refigured our website. Also, just a shameless plug for the Talking Animal Law podcast. So we have covered topics such as domestic abuse and animals and non-stunt slaughter, as well as looking again at careers. So we had an interview with Peter Stevenson from Compassion in World Farming, talking about his career working for an NGO. So find it on Apple or Google or wherever you listen from. And thank you so much to the Young Animal Lawyers Network, and thank you to our speakers for giving up their time. I don't know about everyone else, but I feel as if it's just whizzed past this evening. I know where the time has gone. It's just like, wow, thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, and to Tiffany. I know there's been a lot of hard work behind the scenes getting this together. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today and stayed to the end. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. So virtual claps.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.